So today's episode is gonna be the last episode of the first season. So I wanted to do something a little different with it this time. So throughout the season, we've talked about so many different things. We've talked about society, about gender, and we've talked about identity and expectations, and we've analyzed double standards, the pressure that comes with it, the inequality that exists, and also we have explored how the systems around us, how they shape what we think and how we live. But today, instead of only analyzing the world we already live in, I thought it would be best to, kind of step outside of it for once. Hi, guys, this is Emmy. Welcome back to Who Does She Think She Is? A podcast where we understand the patriarchy, understand who benefits from it, and dismantle it all with a side of tea. Throughout the season, like I said, we've been analyzing the worlds we already lived in. We've been analyzing the systems we're very used to and the systems we think are, quite frankly, normal. But what if society didn't have to look like this at all? What if the structure of society in itself was different? What if power, family, leadership, inheritance, relationship, and gender roles were all organized in completely different ways than what most of us are familiar with? So today we are going to be talking about matriarchal and matrilineal societies and communities. We'll be exploring real communities that have or that still exist where women hold central roles in family structures, inheritance, and social organization. And no, no way is this episode about women dominating men, because when we talk about a matriarchal society or a matrilinear society, that is what people assume it to be. But instead, today we will be asking a much deeper question. What happens when society is built around different values? And even what we can learn from that. But before we go any further, we need to define a few things. Because people throw terms like matriarchy and matrilinear without really understanding what they mean. So it's very important to differentiate between the two and understand both of the terms before we move further into this episode. Like we know, patriarchy is a system where men hold most positions of power and authority, whether it be politically, economically, socially, or historically. And that's the structure that most modern societies, most of our societies, have been built around for centuries. A matriarchy, in theory, it would be the opposite. A society where women hold the primary positions of power. But here's the thing, where it gets interesting is the fact that most societies people call matriarchal are actually matrilineal. And like I said, those are quite different. Matrilineal societies are societies where inheritance, family identity, property, or lineage even, they pass through the women of the family instead of the men. So instead of your family name, land, or wealth being passed from father to son, it might pass from mother to daughter. And honestly, this one structural difference, like that is the core of a matrilineal society. And this difference, like, changes a lot more than you think it would. Because the way society distributes power inside families affects almost everything else. It affects the relationships inside the family, the expectations, the financial security, childcare, marriage, and even the way people define success. And what's really fascinating about many of these matrilineal societies is the fact that they are actually less focused on domination overall. Of course, they're not perfect, and of course, they're not completely conflict free, but they are often way less hierarchical than patriarchal societies. So this obviously challenges the assumption that if women held more power, society would just become patriarchy but reversed, because that is not the case in most communities where women hold more power. So for today, we will be exploring two matrilineal communities. We'll be talking about them in brief, but these are the Mosal community based in China and the Khasi community based in India. I might have pronounced the names wrong, and I am so sorry if that's the case. Let's start by talking about the Mosal community in China, which is, well, it's one of the most famous and well known examples of a matrilineal society. The Musal people live around Lugu Lake in southwest China, and they're often described as one of the world's last matrilineal societies. Now, the first thing people notice about the Musal community is how different their family structure is from what most of us are used to. In many Musar families, the household is centered completely around the women. Grandmothers, mothers, daughters, sisters, all living together in the same home. Property and family lineage are passed to the women. Children stay with the mother's family, and women often play central roles in household decision making. But what really shocks us outsiders is something called walking marriages. So, what we consider to be a traditional marriage and how we look up to a marriage, it historically wasn't the norm in Masao culture. Instead, here, partners could visit each other at night while continuing to live with their own families. And I know for a lot of people listening, that probably sounds extremely strange because most of us grew up believing that there's only one normal, there's only one way for relationships and families to exist. But that's kind of the point. The more you study different societies, the more you realize how many things that we think are natural are actually just our culture. That's just what we grew up seeing. Even the idea of what makes a family complete changes depending on the society. And in Maasai communities, the responsibility of raising children is often way more collective. The maternal family plays a major role. Uncles, grandparents, siblings all contribute. Now, obviously, like I said, no society is perfect. Humans are flawed creatures, so everything we create will be flawed by default. The Mossad community also faces modern pressures, tourism, economic changes, and outside influence. And it is very important not to romanticize them like some perfect feminist paradise, because that would erase their complexity. So instead of romanticizing them, we can simply learn from them that there is another possibility, a completely different way of organizing family life than the one most of us assume is universal simply because that's the way we're all used to. Now, next, let's talk about the Khasi community of India. The Khasi community is based in Meghalaya, India. Again, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. In Khasi culture, the youngest daughter traditionally inherits family property, and family lineage passes through women. And what's even better or like interesting about this community is the fact that children usually take the mother's surname. And again, this completely changes the structure of family expectations that most of us hold. It is quite different from societies where we are mostly used to seeing sons as the heirs or the ones who are expected to carry on the family name. What's even more interesting about the Kasi communities is the fact that here daughters are often viewed as a source of long-term stability for the family. Now, does that mean that men have no role? No, not at all. And this is also where people misunderstand matrilineal societies. These communities are not usually about, removing men from society. Men still participate politically, economically, and socially. The point is that balance and structure are different. And because the structure is different, the social expectations here also become different. For example, let's say in patriarchal societies, women are often expected to leave their family after marriage and become integrated into the husband's family. But in some matrilineal communities, it's the opposite. That changes emotional dynamics, financial dynamics, even the way people experience independence. Again, yeah, none of this feels normal to so many of us. Not because it's wrong, but because we've been conditioned to see only one system as standard. Now, talking about all of these different matrilineal societies and communities, it raises a bigger, more interesting question. If matrilineal societies, if they exist, if they can exist, then why? Why are most societies patriarchal instead? We've talked about the patriarchy and its origins before. In fact, that's the very first thing we talked about in this podcast. But so we know that there isn't one simple answer to the question. Some historians they argue that physical labor and warfare played a huge role historically. In agricultural societies, physical strength it became often tied to survival, land ownership, and military power, and over time, power structures developed around that. Other points point to economics, property ownership, inheritance, religion, colonialism, political systems. There's so many things that kind of feed into it. It's a quite a complex spider web. But we do know that patriarchy didn't just appear randomly. It developed over centuries through institutions that reinforced male authority. And once a system becomes so deeply embedded in laws, culture, religion, and family structures, like we've said before, it starts to feel permanent. And that is one of the most powerful things about social systems. Once people are born into them, they stop looking like systems. They just look like reality. And this applies to literally everything: gender roles, beauty standards, family expectations, work culture, and power structures. What we are born into and what we see as we grow up is what we think is the reality. We rarely question the systems we've normalized, which is why learning about other communities can feel so unsettling. Because suddenly you realize, wait, maybe the way things are isn't the only way things could be. Now, this brings up another question. Would the world actually be better if women held more power? And honestly, I think that's the wrong question. Because this conversation, this whole like exploration, it should not become men bad, women good, or the other way around. Because that oversimplifies human behavior. Power in itself is complicated. Women are not magically incapable of corruption, and men are not biologically incapable of empathy. Us, we human beings, we are all shaped by systems and incentives, our cultures, our fears, our opportunities, and our social conditioning. So instead of asking, would women rule better? The question we should be asking or we should be exploring is what values would become more important in a differently structured society. Because many matrilineal communities tend to emphasize cooperation, caregiving, collective responsibility, and stability, not because women are naturally superior, but because social structures influence what traits are rewarded. Think about the modern society right now. A lot of systems, they reward competition, status, they reward individualism, dominance, productivity, and power. And while those things can drive innovation, they also can create burnout and inequality, emotional isolation, and pressure. So, the main lesson we should be learning from matrilineal societies isn't women should dominate society, but instead, it's what happens when society values caregiving and community as much as it values competition and status. Because honestly, just imagine if emotional intelligence was respected as much as financial success. Imagine if caregiving roles had the same status as corporate roles. Imagine if raising children was viewed as socially valuable labor instead of invisible labor. That would reshape society entirely. So, in the end, of course, modern societies, they cannot just simply suddenly transform into matrilineal communities overnight with a wave of a wand. And that's not even what I'm suggesting right now. But I feel like there are lessons that we can take from these societies. For example, we should maybe rethink the way unpaired caregiving work is undervalued, or we should question why leadership is so often associated with aggression instead of empathy. Maybe we should stop assuming masculinity has to be emotionally distant. Or maybe we should create systems where both men and women are allowed to exist outside rigid gender expectations. And honestly, I feel like the biggest lesson that we can take, like if we take one thing from this whole like season, then take this that there is no single correct way to structure human society. The things we think are fixed often by culture, and culture can change. Slowly, yes, messily, absolutely, but in the end, it can change. What fascinated me most while researching for this episode was realizing just how limited our imagination can become. We grow up inside one version of reality for so long that we stop questioning it. And then, when we see a completely different system, our first instinct is often to mock it, fear it, or assume it's impossible. But different societies reveal something important, that human beings are adaptable. The way we organize relationships, families, power, gender, and identity, none of it is as fixed as we think. And that realization can either, honestly, it can either scare people or free them. Because if systems were created by humans, then humans can also change them. And that is a wrap on our very last episode. I hope you guys had as much fun like throughout this whole season as much as I did, and I wish you all a happy week. Have a nice day, have a nice week, good night, whatever. And bye.